So just to give you an idea of what I'm going to do, so the main purpose of this study is to investigate what is the causal effect of attending a double shift schooling system on learning outcomes. And we do this both at the foundational level, but also at the high school level. And we focus on two critical exams, that is the EGRA, which gives you an idea of the level of literacy at the foundational level, but also we focus on the WASP, which is taken for supply students at grade 1. Okay, and again, results, when the results are out, usually attract a lot of attention, right? It's usually all over the news, and we focus also to see to what extent this affects performance at this level as well. And how we do this, we employ a partial identification approach, which is not the convention in economics research, but to some extent it's one of those techniques that doesn't rely on strong assumptions, but actually allows you to say much, allow the data to speak for itself without you trying to impose restrictions on what the functional relationship will be. And what we find is that, as expected, we do find negative effect of the double shift schooling system on learning outcomes. And just to give you an idea, what we find at the lower level, and this is focused only on public primary schools, if we were to eliminate the double shift schooling system, improvements in performance that we expect to get at lower levels is less than a 1 curriculum award increase in the various EGRA subtypes, including letter names, letter sounds, familiar words, oral reading fluency. This is what we estimate using the available research. And I think this is of interest, especially to the ministry, who is thinking of removing the system completely, eliminating it. Okay, so reducing it, but eliminating the double shifting of it. And I think this is super important because here you can see it's only about 1 letter increase on the various universities. On the other hand, when you focus on the high school level, focusing only on private schools, this is what we estimate to be the potential gains by eliminating the double shift schooling system. And I think this should be very intuitive as well. We should not be too surprised with these results. Yes, we expect eliminating it will lead to improvements in learning outcomes, but more so in private schools at the high school level. Okay, and this is typically what we estimate. Now I'll give you a detail of exactly what we do to arrive at this. Okay, but just to put this, put ideas in perspective so we can be able to put the rest of the presentation. Now, I will move straight by talking about the research questions, the background and the context, and the framework through which we use to analyze this effect, and then the data we have as well as the method we use and the key findings that we have from this study. Now, as we all know, it's been a policy debate around, it's been attracted public attention over the past few years in the Gambia, but also in many other countries. So for instance, in Jamaica as well, in Ghana, many other countries, there has been an increasing call to abolish or to reduce the number of schools that are practicing double shift schooling. But we also know that abolishing this is quite costly. In the Gambia here, the Permanent Secretary earlier just gave us an idea of what it will cost if we were to do this. And I should say this, that earlier, one of the reasons that actually brought my mind towards focusing on this was, there was a particular interview that I think the PSC granted some time back, probably 2-3 years back maybe, where he gave an idea of how much it will cost us to eliminate the double shift schooling system. I cannot recall the figures right now, but it's in the range of hundreds of millions, right? And so for me, the big question was, will this really translate to improvements in learning outcomes? What do we see? Do we see schools that are practicing single shift performing better than those that are practicing double shift? And so this was actually the one of the main motivators behind doing this study. Okay, and so I would think, again, thinking of the potential policy options to eliminate the shift systems, one of it would be, for instance, just moving all students in afternoon shift to morning shift in schools where there is still space to accommodate larger class size. Let's say in a school where we have 30 students in the morning shift, another 30 students in the afternoon shift, and it's the same grade, we could just say, well, we can double the class size, but have all of them go in the morning shift and increase the number of hours. So allow them to increase the number of hours that they spend at school. So this is one potential policy option to consider as a management. Otherwise, we could say, well, we have 2 schools located in a very close neighborhood, but one of them is oversubscribed, so that they are forced to practice the double shift. Another one is not highly subscribed, and they just practice single shift. So we could actually we could actually encourage students to move from one of the schools to the other schools, so that they're able to all just have a single shift operating in the schools. Okay, but what is much more likely, and as the other by PhD, is the fact that one of the potential options that is more likely to happen is that government will be forced to build more classrooms, but also to hire more teachers to be able to expand this. Now, the other two options I mentioned depends on many things, okay? So we first of all know the reason why schools are practicing double shift is because the class size are extremely large, the students cannot fit in one class. So that's not even a problem. That's not even an option in many things. It could be maybe in very remote and in very few instances, but in majority of the cases, really need to require us to build more classrooms and hire more teachers. But we know again the constraints involved in hiring qualified teachers. So the ministry has difficulty hiring qualified teachers, and so we know this is in addition to the cost, but also is the maintaining itself. Okay, and I think the earlier statements by the peers actually had a lot about this. And like I said, the most important question is we don't have enough evidence to say that by doing this we would improve learning outcomes. So this is where this study comes into play. And one of the reasons why we don't see most of this being done in the empirical literature, especially in the economics of education literature, is because it's very challenging. There is nothing like an clear exogenous variation to say we could easily exploit this to be able to say this is the causal effect. Okay, and so how I do this instead is to use another approach that is not very conventional in the field, but actually allows us to give some very clear insights as to what we could potentially expect. So again, the policy interest question is, will transitioning from a double shift to single shift improve learning outcomes under current conditions? Again, this is assuming that all we do is just to reallocate schools from being a double shift to a single shift, nothing else changes. Okay, that is the status quo I'm assuming in this case. Obviously, it's not. It might not be the case that that place where my probably this might be complementing the other activities as well. But if we do so under the current conditions, we will be seeing improvements in learning outcomes. And then the question is, if it does lead to improvements in learning outcomes, by how much? Okay, again, more of a cost benefit analysis. So to what extent is it really worth the extra cost? Okay? And so the research question I do is to ask this question more clearly. So what is the current impact of attending a double shift schooling system on student performance at both the foundational level, but also at the high school level? Okay, which I think are very critical parts of the education system. And a bit about the Gambian context, which most of you are very familiar with, is that in terms of the double shift, in how this practice in the Gambia, we mainly have, broadly we can classify them into two. Okay, we have what is called a weekly or bi-weekly rotation between morning and afternoon, where you spend 1 week in the morning shift, the other week in the afternoon shift for 2 weeks or 1 day and so on. So rotation, mainly rotation of days, whether you're placed on a permanent shift. Or we have the system where you're placed either permanently in the morning or permanently in the afternoon. Okay, so this is broadly, most of the other variations we have generally falls into this category. And in terms of the number of hours that they spend at school, depending on the shift system, we see regular class we know generally starts at 8:30 in this country, and most of them close at 1:30 p.m. with single shift schools having study classes from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. Okay, and this is not available to those in double shift schools because most of them are forced to leave to create space so that those in the afternoon shift can come and occupy the same facilities. Okay, on Fridays it's a half day, so the morning shift, but also students in single shift schools close at midday, but then the afternoon shift students starts a bit earlier and then close in the normal during the normal closing time. This allows them to recover part of the hours lost as a result of the double shift. Because you see that in terms of the number of hours spent, those in the morning shift actually has a few more hours, about 1 hour or a bit more compared to those that are in the afternoon. Though they partly compensate in 5 days, but it's actually not enough to offset the difference in learning number of hours spent in school. Again, I'm looking at number of hours spent in school, not necessarily the actual contract hours between students and teachers. Okay, but just broadly assuming that this to some extent informs how much actual learning goes into the classroom. So on average, weekly school hours for students in single shift schools about 32 hours a week, and those in double shift schools generally spend about 24 hours, which is largely driven to a large extent by the related ties that these students in single shift schools actually do. Now, in terms of how prevalent the double shift is in the Gambia, on average, you will estimate that about 72% of all public schools operate a double shift. Of course, there is variation at the foundational level, at the middle school, and the high school level. If anything, we find that it's a lot more prevalent at the higher levels than at the lower levels. At the lower levels, you have the less number of schools that are actually doing the double shift. Okay, and more importantly also is about the choice. Okay, so school choice here is heterogeneous. Heterogeneous in the sense that people are free to choose. So whether I choose to attend a single shift or double shift is largely informed by things like accessibility, affordability, and whether I meet the requirements, the recruitment requirements of that specific. Okay, and so this actually poses a problem when it comes to being able to estimate, because to some extent you have to think about how do I about the subject. What I'm observing is not just a mere correlation, but actually it's clearly causal effect estimation. And again, another important point is the fact that there is double shifting of teachers, which is also widely practiced. Though again, the ministry has a clear objective of being able to phase this out by 2030. Okay, I don't have much data to say much about it, but again, we know it's one of the characteristics of double shift. Teachers either teach in the same school double shift, or they teach either in different schools a double shift. So conceptually, just to put ideas, organize thoughts in terms of how we look at this. So in terms of the challenge, we expect the double shift, through which we expect the double shift of learning outcomes. One which is very clear and very obvious is reducing instructional time. I just highlighted this in the case of the Gambia. You find the students in double shift schools have relatively less contact hours in school as opposed to those that are in single shift. But also we know the fact that teacher fatigue is common. If you teach in double shift, in both shifts, in morning shift, and also if you teach in the afternoon shift, you are exhausted, you're working for 2 long hours, and so probably you have less time to prepare enough for class, but also maybe to even assess students properly. And so these things obviously comes into play. So your delivery itself in the classroom might be affected, right? But also we know another factor that potentially affects is the learning conditions. So the weather conditions that we have in the country in the afternoon, it's mostly the case that it's very hot. In many of these schools, it's extremely very, especially in rural areas. Okay, and so learning outcomes itself will be affected independently. And especially for the students that are like starting their day at that time, this is obviously much more disadvantageous to them. Now, one study that has been done probably a few years ago, looking at the impact of double shift in the motor quality study, actually they found that students who are attending, female students that are attending double shift schools, are even faced with increased household responsibilities. So typically, they are required to help with household chores in the morning before going to school in the afternoon shift, or if they close early since they're coming back very early, they will sort of like have additional household chores that they will require to do, or help with their parents, with the partner, and so on. So, but this has been established that actually, to some extent, it disadvantages us. Okay, and so this study also will actually try to see if there's a gender dimension in terms of the impact of double shift on learning outcomes. Now, these are some of the challenges we expect would be through which the double shift will affect learning outcomes. And if anything, I think out of these challenges listed here, probably the one that was the main driving one is in terms of instructional time, the lost number of hours that students will lose because of their use of double shift. Of course, the issue of teacher fatigue comes into play both in double shift but also in single shift, because teachers in private schools will teach study class from 2 to 4 p.m., but then also will probably engage in their own private study class that they organize for students in their various schools. And so they also probably to some extent also higher. Similarly, the advanced conditions in the afternoon, again, the main source of difference in instructional hours comes largely from the after-school classes that students in single schools will have. So if anything, we expect if the effect, if the adverse weather conditions have an effect on learning outcomes, to some extent it's also going to affect those students that are also attending this study class in single schools. And so the effectiveness will likely go both ways. But if anything, so my theory is that if anything, one of the main driving force here in terms of the differences to reduce instructional time. Now, there could be possibility that schools, students, and teachers may adopt some mitigating strategies. So, for instance, it's the case of that, since I am teaching in a very big school that has, I don't know, maybe 5 grade 1 classes, okay, so I will be expected to teach only grade 1 in the morning, but also grade 1 afternoon. Or let's say at the high school level, I teach only English morning and afternoon, so I don't teach more than one subject, which probably will not be available for single schools, which are very small, so then they are forced to have teachers teach multiple subjects. Okay, so you teach both English, literature, arts and drama. So this actually, to some extent, students will have. So this could somehow be a strategy that schools are adopting to mitigate some of the negative effects of being in a double shift. But also, it could be the case that students could also, decide to organize themselves in terms of peer study group classes, so that they are able to, work as a group to compensate for some of the hours that they lose in terms of learning. So I won't be able to speak very clearly on what exactly I would you say this is the main channel? Because I don't have much data to speak to that. But I'm just saying that these are potentially all factors that comes into play if you were to consider the main mechanism through which the double stream may have to be learning happens. This is data that we So in terms of the data that we have access to, two types of data. The WAS data, which is taken by grade 12 students, and it contains test scores. Here we don't have much information, we only have data on the test scores of students, indicator of the school ownership type and the school shift, and very few bio information of students at the WAS level. So we are able to do as much analysis at the WAS level like we do at the lower level. But again, to some extent, we believe that what we find at the lower level is also related at the higher level. So we sort of like, to some extent, rely on that in terms of the validity. At the lower level, we use the ALI bullying assessment data, and we use guys are not supposed to, but why not the most recent one? So the most recent one doesn't have as much bio data as we have in 2016. Okay, so we are able to control for much. I do have access to the data source as well, but I do not use it because it doesn't really inform much in terms of this. So to some extent, you can be careful that the results may be things that happened probably almost 9 years ago or so. But here we have a lot of data on student performance on each of the EGRA subtasks, but also the characteristics and household characteristics of the students, as well as the school and teacher characteristics, as well as teaching practices of teachers in the school system. So it's very rich information that we really could exploit to inform what we want to do in this study. So I probably will just skip this, but again, just to mention that when looking at student performance at the high school level, we do not look at students in public schools simply because we don't have much variation in students that are attending double shift and single shift in public schools at the high school level. Most of the schools at the high school level operate a double shift schooling system, those that are in public schools. So we have limited variation to be able to exploit that for the course of this course. Previously, we attempted to do those analysis, but we find that the results were not very convincing because there is not much variation to explore. So we instead choose to focus at the high school level only on student performance at the WAS. Student performance in private schools. Okay, so at the private school, you can see here the share of students that are in double C school is about 56%. So only about 6% of students in our data that are in private schools are in double shift schools. Okay, so maybe about 44% are in single shift schools. So a lot of variation there. Whereas we look at for the public schools, about maybe over 90% of students in public schools that are actually in, at least for those that took the exams. This is for students that registered for the exams and they got a score for the exams. Similarly, for the effect at the foundational level, using the EGRA data, also we notice that at the foundational level, at the EGRA level, what you find is that most of the private schools operate a single shift. There is very limited number of private schools at the lower level that are operating double shift. Okay? Now, at least as what we found in the database of 2016, based on the principle that we have. So it's possible that there is a lot more, but because the EGRA is not a nationally representative data, so it's not a population data, it's actually a sample. Okay, so it's possible that maybe to some extent it's a bit biased, but we don't have enough information on private schools that are practicing private shift at the lower level. So we instead choose to focus only on public schools at the foundational level. Okay, which I think is probably one of the most interesting parts for the ministry as a whole, where they can actually do something about it. So here you see, for instance, the number of students in WC schools, number of students at the foundational level that are in WC schools about 40%. So about 60% of them are in single shift schools at the foundational level, which I think is fine. So here you have a lot of variation to be able to explore to say, okay, well, we can make some comparisons across. Okay, and of course we have some statistics about student performance on the various EGRA classes as well. So here I didn't mention on a WAS level that on average, of course it's known that on average, if you look at the criteria that the university set as minimum admission requirements, over the past 12 years or so, it's been about 5% over there. Last year's results were extremely good. Overall, it's on average about 5%. Okay, and of course, if anything, we see students in private schools performing better. So, and this is what we report here is actually making the upper bound of student performance. Now, looking at the difference in performance between students in double shift schools and students in single shift schools, what we observe is that students that are in double shift schools, as expected, have a lower chance of obtaining the minimum university entry requirement. You can see this about, on average, 4%, and then you can see the one for the single shift schools about more than 6%. Okay, of course, you see a sort of like a trend that seems to have been improving. However, it's important to highlight that there has been studies that have shown that the reason why you see a difference in performance over time may not necessarily be that students are actually learning more, but it's just sometimes largely due to the differences in the difficulty of the exams across periods. Now, this was something I had, when I was in junior school. I looked at some exam papers. It's like, this year was much more easier than this year. I have had these options before, but there has been a study published in the Journal of Human Research that actually shows that in a particular year, for instance, number of students that failed the exams, had they taken the exam in a different year, they would have had a very good chance of getting a credit score. So the essence of comparability, so we cannot use this to sort of like compare the data over some period, because again, the exam difficulty of the questions aren't the same. Okay, so this is something to keep in mind. So, and here, of course, we are not making comparison over time, we're just taking the average. Okay, so we're just looking at, we're not looking at students between year 1 and year 2, but we're just looking within the same year, what is the difference in learning outcomes. Okay, and you can see students selected for passing English and mathematics, of course, it will improve over time. Now, at the foundational level, I use letter names or familiar words, okay, or oral meaning to your friends. So instead, I standardize this to score between 0 and 1. And if anything, you observe that they are grade 1, you see students in single shift schools generally outperform those that are in double shift schools as expected. And at the same thing, if you look at grade 2, however, this gap seems to close. And if anything, students in double shift this is probably very interesting for most of us to see, because again, you would expect, well, but they did better at the earliest stage, why it's actually causing the changes. But again, we know many schools come into play, the NAT is coming in, and so probably schools are investing more time, prioritizing the students and so on. But at least this is what we observe based on the data. Now, coming to the methodology, one of the most challenging part here is how to address the issue of selection bias. So we know that choosing to go to, let's say, a double shift school or single shift school, many factors comes into play. So if I know I don't have a good chance of getting admission to school A, okay, probably I wouldn't go to that school, okay? Or if I know I will not be able to do well in that school, I probably wouldn't go to that school. So that's one of the challenges that we have in terms of the causal effect. That is to say that students voluntarily choose where to go. So the allocation to whether you attend a double or a single shift school is not random. Okay, and this is important to keep in mind, because in this case, when you're comparing, you probably will compare something very different. Now, more importantly also, the decision of schools to operate a double shift or a single shift is also not random. So schools sometimes are forced to operate a double shift because there's an increase in demand for the school. Maybe it's located in a settlement where you don't have many students where you don't have enough schools in the neighborhood and you have more students that want to gain admission. And so the school is actually forced to operate on this. Okay, so this is different from a school voluntarily that we want to just have this, and so we expect students to come. So this could be very different. And so another element of the selection bias that comes into play again is the decision to operate a single shift or a double shift school also is not random. So these are two potential problems that you may want to consider, especially for my colleagues here from the economics field. Identification is one of the biggest questions that we have when doing this kind of study. And so this is what we will try to address in this study. And how we try to address it in this study, we use what is called the partial identification approach. So we don't try to identify to say that this is the effect, this is the exact point effect. But instead, what we try to do is to estimate an upper and lower bound. We say, well, we cannot precisely estimate this is the exact effect, but we can give you with some level of confidence that the effect falls between this and this. Okay, so we have, at the worst case, this is what we will have, and the best is what we will expect. So this is exactly what we're doing. And the good thing is that here, we don't have any assumptions that we make. We don't impose the assumption of exogeneity or no multiple. We don't make any of the assumptions like we do in the economics studies. Here, you allow the data to speak for itself. The data determines what the relationship is. You're not imposing any assumptions. We do make some little assumptions, but the assumptions we make, we also try to see if the data actually aligns with what we are assuming. Okay, and so again, it's important to highlight that this particular approach has been used in many studies recently. It's gaining a lot of traction, and you find a lot of good papers published on very good journals about how to use this technique, especially when you're faced with similar challenges. Now, this is the main model. I promise this is the only model I will show here, so don't miss here. I promise this is the only one you will see here. Okay, but the point here is zero ability is to the first. The change is in performance from moving from a single shift to a double shift. Okay, so imagine that Y of 0 the first performance of students in the single shift, and Y of 1 the first performance of students in the double shift. Now, again, one of the biggest challenges we have here is we can only observe students in one stage. If it was possible to observe you, if you were in double shift school, this is how well you perform, and if you are in a single shift school, this is how well you perform. We can easily just look at the difference and say, in which of these skills you perform. But we know it's not possible. We cannot observe you in both states at the same time. Right? So we cannot observe you both being in a double shift school at the same time in a single shift school. The biggest challenge is how do you find a comparison group? Whom will we compare you with? Okay, and we cannot say that performance of students in double shift schools is a proxy of performance of what students in single shift school will have had. Okay, so this to some extent is one of the biggest questions that we have to address. And so here we don't try to look for a perfect comparison group. The good thing is that the analysis is restricted to the same school ownership type. So we focus only on public schools, and we focus only on learning outcomes at that level there. So we are not minding both public and private at the same time. We could have made analysis much more classical. We focus only on within public schools, the difference in double shift and single shift schools. Okay? And so how we do this is that we say, well, we cannot say much about what your performance would have been had you been in a different shift system rather than the one that you are currently at. And so we start with making a very simple analysis. We say, but we know that at worst, if you take these exams, regardless of whether you are in a double shift or a single shift school, you will score at worst the minimum score, which is fail or 0, and at best you will get A plus or maybe 100%. So we know there is a bound. We know there is an upper limit and there is a lower limit to what you can potentially score. And so we just put it there just to see what is the likelihood that you get this and what is the likelihood that you get a pass or a fail. And so we just put this there and just see what we have. And so this is important because we know it's not possible that your score could be anything else. So we still obtain a lower bound and an upper bound, but then these bounds are large enough that they may be very important. And so we go further to say, well, we also know that if anything, or we are assuming here, that students in double shift schools are negatively selected. If anything, we know students that are from relatively poorer backgrounds are more likely to be attending double shift schools than students from relatively richer backgrounds. This assumption actually makes sense. And so when you look at the data, this is what also we find. We find that yes, it is the case that when you look at most of these indicators of socioeconomic status, you find it's the case that yes, it's not surprisingly, for instance, when you look at having tap water at home, students in the double shift schools, so here tap water at home, students in single shift schools are about 28% chance of having that, or 28% of students in our sample have access to tap water at home, whereas only 24% of students in double shift schools have access to this. Okay, so the difference is just telling the difference between improvement, and it starts indicating statistical significance in the difference. Necessarily the difference in the mere difference. Okay, so here you find again when it comes to the probability of having it in the morning, also it's higher for students that are in single shift schools than also the students that are in double shift schools. Likewise, having any form of previous education also is higher for students that are in single shift schools than in double shift schools. So to some extent, we can say, well, the assumption that we make that students in double shift schools are negatively selected is somehow tenable. We can actually go with it because the data supports this assumption that we make. Now, the other assumption we also make, again, this is essentially here, what we're trying to do is we're trying to say part of the difference in learning outcomes we observe between students in double shift schools and single shift schools is largely because of differences in underlying characteristics. Okay, and so we will try to narrow this down and what happens if we eliminate that, what extent we reduce this gap. Okay? The other assumption we make here is to say that, well, what is called monitoring treatment response. Here we are restricting a direction on the treatment effect. Here we are saying that, or we are assuming that performance of students is strictly decreasing function of attending a double shift school. We are saying if you attend a double shift school, there is a good chance that you will not perform better than someone who is attending a single school. At best, your performance will be the same or lower, but it cannot be higher than someone attending a single school. So if you have two students with similar backgrounds, everything the same, if one of them attends a single school, or one attends a double school, we are saying that the one in a double school, at best, cannot perform more than what a student in a single school will be. Okay, and so again, this assumption as well, if you look at the data, looking at the school characteristics, student characteristics as well, you find that to some extent the production function for knowledge or the education production function for students in double school is much more lower than the one for students in single schools. Okay, so we see that students in double school actually have a larger class size. So you see PPT ratio in single school is much lower than those in double school, and the difference is quite significant. But also having somebody to help you at home as well is much higher for students in single schools than those in double schools. Similarly, if you look at parent being aware that the student is doing well in school or not, it's higher for students in single schools than in double schools. But also looking at, of course, share of female teachers, to some extent you could use as a proxy for sort of like say motivation or inspiration for young girls that are aspiring to become to do well in school, sort of like as a role model. You could see this sort of like as a proxy for role model for girls in schools. Okay, but also if you look at experience levels, teachers in single schools are much more experienced than those in double school, but also they are much more experienced in teaching a specific grade. So not only how many years of experience you have teaching, but also the experience you have in teaching that specific classroom. And more importantly, the number of qualified teachers is higher in single schools than we have in double schools. Okay, similarly, in terms of having access to a library as well, it's much higher in a single school there. So all of this taken into account, we believe that the education production function for students attending a double school is much lower than the education production function for students attending a single school, assuming that all these factors contribute to learning outcomes. Okay, so if we assume that if we agree that people teacher ratio is an important determinant of student performance in school, having someone to help you at home is important, or having a teacher that is well experienced in teaching a specific grade, or a teacher that is well qualified. If we agree that this is important, then we would agree that the education production function for students in double school is much worse than that of students in single schools. Now, this is important to mention here, because previously I presented this somewhere, and the question I received was that this doesn't make sense, that the pupil teacher ratio in single schools is much lower than that in double schools. They're like, that goes against the objective of having a double school, because the idea was to reduce the class. So how is it possible that they have this? So to some extent, I had a lot of criticism saying that okay, it doesn't make sense, and I have to explain it to them for them to understand. But I guess in this context, we know. So for instance, where I did my high school, we practice a double shift system, and the class size in my first year in graduation was about 78 students in the morning shift. Okay, so that was only in a single classroom. Of course, it's still double shift, but again, the demand was so high that you need to have such number of students in school. So I guess in this one, it's not going to be difficult to convince you that this is actually still the case. Now, the other assumption that we make here is what is called